March 7th, 1945, 16:35 hours. East bank of the Rhine River, Remagen, Germany. The air smelled of burnt steel and cordite. What had been a German defensive line hours earlier now lay silent. A graveyard of twisted metal, half-buried helmets, and the faint hiss of fires dying in the cold March wind. Private First Class Thomas Bennett, 9th Armored Division medic, moved carefully through the wreckage. Somewhere beyond the smoke, the Ludendorff Bridge still stood, impossibly, after the Germans' failed demolition attempt. It was the bridge that shouldn't have existed anymore. The one that had given the U.S. Army its first foothold across the Rhine, a gateway into the heart of Hitler's collapsing empire. For the men crossing it, it was victory. For Bennett, it was something else entirely. A field of broken bodies that didn't care who had won. He heard a sound that didn't belong. Not the coarse groans of dying soldiers, not the mechanical cough of a tank. A high-pitched whimper, soft, uncertain, human. He followed it into a crater blasted open by artillery, where the smoke cleared just enough to show movement. A German soldier crouched against the dirt wall, clutching his leg. Blood soaked the fabric. His right hand trembled around a pistol, the barrel tracking Bennett's chest. Bennett froze. He'd been here before, too many times. But something was off. The face looking back at him wasn't a man's. The cheeks were smooth, the eyes wide with terror. The uniform hung loose, as if it belonged to an older brother. This wasn't a soldier. This was a child wearing a soldier's costume. "Easy, son," Bennett said quietly, raising both hands. "Medic. Sanitator." The boy's hand wavered, his mouth open, maybe to shout, maybe to pray, and then the pistol fell into the mud. He pressed himself back into the crater and started to cry. Not the quiet tears of a wounded man, but the desperate heaving sobs of someone who'd finally run out of courage. Bennett climbed down slowly, set his bag beside the boy, and reached for the wound. Shrapnel. Bad, but survivable. The kid flinched as Bennett cleaned the blood away, his eyes darting like an animal's. "You're gonna be okay," Bennett said, voice low and steady. The boy didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. When Bennett wrapped the bandage tight, the boy whispered a single word in broken English. "Warum?" Why? There wasn't a translation big enough for that question. Bennett just looked at him, this child the Reich had thrown into the fire, and said quietly, "Because it's my job." And then he moved on, leaving the boy alive in a war built to kill him. When Bennett finished with the boy's leg, he sat back on his heels, breath heavy, hands trembling slightly. He'd patched up hundreds of wounds since Normandy. Bullet holes, burns, missing limbs. But this one felt different. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, maybe younger. Too small for the helmet that slid down over his eyes. Too thin for the heavy winter coat draped over his shoulders. His dog tags were blank, just stamped metal discs without a name. The Germans had stopped giving their child soldiers proper identification. It was easier that way. Easier not to count them when they didn't come back. Bennett opened his field notebook and wrote a few words. German, approx. 16 wars, shrapnel wound, calf, stabilized. He tore a piece of chocolate from his ration pack and handed it to the boy. The kid stared at it like he didn't recognize what it was. When he finally took a bite, his expression changed. Confusion, disbelief, then a flood of something that looked like grief. Behind them, the ground shook. Artillery again, but farther off now. The line was moving east, deeper into the country. For the Allies, the war was racing toward its end. For the German army, it was collapsing inward, and it was doing so on the backs of its children. In towns across the Rhineland, the Volkssturm, the People's Army, had been scraping together the last reserves of a dying regime. Men over 50, boys under 17. Most had no training, no supplies, but the orders were clear. Fight to the last bullet. The Hitler Youth, boys who'd once marched in parades, sang songs about loyalty, and believed the Reich would last 1,000 years, were now being handed rifles that weighed more than they did. Some never fired a shot. Others fought until they were cut down where they stood, driven not by courage but by terror. The terror of what they'd been told would happen if they surrendered. Bennett had seen it before. In the Ardennes, in the towns along the Moselle, bodies small enough to be mistaken for civilians, faces that still had the softness of childhood beneath the dirt and blood. He'd learned to stop asking how old they were. It didn't matter anymore. But this one, the boy in the crater, had survived. And that, Bennett decided, meant something. When the evacuation jeep arrived, Bennett helped lift the wounded onto stretchers. As the medics loaded the boy, he reached out, gripping Bennett's sleeve. Their eyes met for a moment, and Bennett saw something flicker there. Not gratitude, not relief, just shock. Shock that the man who'd been his enemy had chosen to save him. The field hospital was a collection of tents pitched on muddy ground just west of the Rhine. Canvas walls flapped in the cold March wind, and the air smelled of iodine, diesel, and damp cloth. Inside, the wounded lay in rows, Americans, Germans, sometimes both on the same stretcher line. Bennett moved through the aisles with his hands still shaking. He'd carried that German boy all the way from the crater to the aid station, whispering words the kid couldn't understand, hoping the tone alone could keep him conscious. Now, under the yellow glow of a lantern, a nurse cleaned the boy's wound while Bennett filled out the tag. Enemy casualty, priority B, transport when stable. The nurse glanced up. "You treat him like one of ours," she said quietly. Bennett didn't answer right away. He just looked at the boy's face, pale, thin, eyes closed, the corners of his mouth trembling as if he were still crying in his sleep. Then he said, "He is one of ours, just hasn't figured it out yet." Outside, rain began to fall. Each drop hissed against the canvas like distant gunfire. Bennett stepped out for air and leaned against an ambulance. Across the muddy yard, a truckload of new prisoners arrived, German teenagers mostly, barely out of school. They looked terrified. Some still wore Hitler Youth armbands. Most didn't even have boots. He watched as medics moved toward them, motioning with open hands. "Come, sit. You're safe now." The boys hesitated. They'd been told that surrender meant torture, that American medics would experiment on them, that mercy was a lie. And yet here they were, being given blankets, water, and cigarettes. One boy broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Another stared blankly, as if trying to understand the trick. For the medics, it was just another shift. But for the prisoners, it was a collapse. Not of armies or nations, but of lies. Later that night, Bennett sat writing by flashlight. His hands were still dirty, his sleeves stiff with dried blood. He wrote in his journal, "I don't know what winning means anymore. We cross bridges, take towns, count prisoners. But tonight I think I saw what victory really looks like. A boy who thought I'd kill him, and lived instead." The next morning before sunrise, Bennett was back in the field, and somewhere behind him, a German teenager, once an enemy, was waking up alive. The field hospital smelled of antiseptic, smoke, and damp canvas. Everywhere, the sounds of war had been replaced by quieter, stranger ones, the hiss of morphine syringes, the tearing of bandage rolls, the labored breathing of men too weak to cry out anymore. Cots were lined up so closely that one man's outstretched hand could touch the next. On one side of the tent, Americans. On the other, Germans. Same bandages, same IV lines, same weary nurses moving between them. Bennett was stitching a shrapnel wound when he noticed the boy across the aisle. Another German teenager, no older than 16, staring at him through half-lidded eyes. The kid's lips moved weakly. "Warum?" he whispered. Bennett paused. He didn't know enough German to answer, but he understood the question. "Why are you helping me?" He thought for a moment, then said softly, "Because someone has to stop the bleeding." The boy blinked, then nodded, as if that answer, simple, human, was somehow enough. Hours later, as Bennett made his rounds, he saw an American nurse quietly feeding another German prisoner from a tin cup. The prisoner's hands were bandaged. He couldn't hold the cup himself. The nurse didn't speak German. The boy didn't speak English. But in the way she tilted the cup, wiped his mouth, adjusted his blanket, they understood each other. It was the kind of moment no report or medal would ever record, a moment when mercy replaced orders and humanity survived the war. Night fell over the field hospital like a heavy blanket. The air was thick with the mixed smells of iodine, sweat, and gunpowder that refused to fade. Somewhere outside, distant artillery echoed. But here, under the canvas roof, war had taken on a quieter, stranger shape. The cries had softened into whispers. You could hear the steady rhythm of scissors cutting gauze, the rattle of a metal tray, the muffled prayers in English and German blending into one. Bennett moved between cots, his boots leaving prints in the muddy ground. He paused beside a German boy, the same one from the crater, his face pale but calm now. The wound had stopped bleeding. His breathing was even. When the boy's eyes fluttered open, Bennett saw recognition flicker there. "Sanitator," the boy whispered, his accent thick, voice trembling. Then, with visible effort, he added in broken English, "Not bad." Bennett smiled faintly. "No, not bad." He adjusted the blanket, checking the pulse again. Steady, fragile, alive. Across the tent, a nurse was helping a German prisoner sip from a cup, her hands shaking slightly from exhaustion. An American corporal, leg wrapped in bandages, reached out to hand a cigarette to the wounded man beside him, a former enemy. The German took it with hesitation. Then, slowly, he smiled back. No one spoke, but something was shifting in that silence, something that felt bigger than orders or victory. Bennett looked around and thought how strange it was. How men who had tried to kill each other a day ago could now share warmth, water, and silence, as if the war had burned away everything except what made them human. Schla that night, under the low hum of lanterns and the rustle of bandages, the war paused, just long enough for mercy to breathe. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of light that makes everything look colorless. Uniforms, skin, sky, all the same shade of exhaustion. A low mist crawled through the ruined trees and across the muddy field, creeping into the hospital tents where the night's work still hadn't ended. The air smelled of wet canvas, iodine, and smoke. the scent of a world slowly stitching itself back together. Bennett sat on a wooden crate just outside the tent, his hands raw and trembling from scrubbing blood out of bandages in icy water. His uniform was stiff with dried mud, his helmet dented from shrapnel that had missed him by inches. He stared at the horizon, where the faint glow of morning blurred into the smoke from burning villages. He knew the war was still raging somewhere out there. But here, in this patch of earth turned into a hospital, something was shifting. Inside the tent, the German boy from the crater was awake. He looked impossibly young now, his face clean, hair damp from the medic's sponge. Someone had given him a tin mug of coffee. He held it like it was something holy, his hands shaking as if he couldn't believe warmth could still exist in a place like this. When Bennett stepped inside, the boy tried to sit up straighter. He winced from pain but managed a faint smile. His English was broken, but the word came clear. Why? Bennett froze, the question hanging in the air like smoke. Why? It could have meant 1,000 things. Why save me? Why fight this war? Why are you kind when everything around us is cruel? There wasn't an answer that would make sense to either of them. So Bennett just said quietly, "Because that's what we do." The boy's eyes filled, not with tears, but with the hollow disbelief of someone realizing the world might be bigger than he was taught. He nodded once, slow, deliberate, and leaned back against the pillow. Across the tent, another medic was wrapping a bandage around an American's shoulder. A nurse was giving a sip of water to a wounded German, her hands trembling but gentle. For the first time, you couldn't tell who was enemy and who was friend. Just men, broken, bleeding, alive. Later, Bennett saw one of his comrades hand a chocolate bar to a German youth missing a shoe. The boy laughed, embarrassed, the sound thin but real, a small proof that humanity could survive the ruins. Outside, the low rumble of engines grew louder. Trucks waited in the pale dawn to carry the wounded to the rear. The mist lifted slowly, revealing a landscape scarred but quiet. Bennett stood there for a moment, his hands still and heavy. The war wasn't over yet, but it felt like something inside it had died. The hatred, the division, the need to see the other side as less than human. In that muddy tent by the Rhine, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and the sound of labored breathing, the line between enemy and ally blurred completely. And for the first time in years, mercy didn't feel like weakness. It felt like victory. The war ended not with a roar, but with the slow, uneven rhythm of bandaged hearts still beating beneath a ruined sky. Across the broken fields of Germany, the echo of artillery faded into wind. The soldiers who had once carried rifles now carried stretchers. The sound of gunfire was replaced by quiet voices, by the rustle of bandages, by the breath of men who refused to let death have the final word. Bennett remained in uniform long after the victory parades had passed. He stayed because his war had never really been about conquest. It had been about mercy, about proving in the ugliest corner of history that compassion could still exist. He remembered faces more than places. The German boy with shaking hands and a clean bandage. The nurse who whispered comfort in a language the wounded couldn't understand. The men who learned that saving an enemy's life was the truest form of victory. Years later, when the tents were gone and hospitals rose in their place, the Red Cross still meant the same thing, that life was sacred even when nations forgot it. The same symbol that once marked muddy canvas in a bombed field now hung above clean corridors where children were born instead of soldiers dying. History would remember the dates, the treaties, the cities liberated, the armies that advanced. But the real victory wasn't written in official reports or carved into medals. It lived in the small, quiet moments when compassion overcame vengeance, when a soldier looked at his enemy and saw not a monster, but a mirror. And so the war truly ended not on paper, but in the hearts of those who chose to heal instead of harm. Because wars don't end when the shooting stops. They end when mercy becomes stronger than hate. When saving a single life matters more than taking one. When the act of healing becomes humanity's final, greatest resistance.